Well, hello there. Welcome to my podcast, and this is actually episode 300 of it, at least officially. And today I'm going to offer what I'm calling an anarchic take on capitalism's economic questions and gender norms. So, what an interesting way to celebrate the 300th episode. So, yes, welcome to another episode of Critical Weight Theory, where we do things like review movies and TV shows and talk about various subjects and occasionally dissect contemporary issues through an anarchic lens. So today we're diving deep into how capitalism answers the fundamental economic questions and examining how production affects contemporary attitudes towards gendered symbols. So, if that's a boring topic for you, well, I'm going to apologize in advance, but that's what's going to happen here. So let's unravel these topics and explore their implications on our society, shall we? So, this is going to be segment one: how capitalism answers the three basic economic questions. So, capitalism relies on the free market, at least as they call it, to answer the three basic economic questions: what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce. But what does this really mean, and how does it align or clash with anarchist principles? Well, spoiler alert, it often does clash with those principles, and in fact, it often clashes with its own stated principles, but let's break it down. So, the question is what to produce. That's one of the main questions that is posed in the trio. So, in a capitalist system, the question of what to produce is primarily answered by consumer demand. I mean, a person could debate that it's actually, answered by the force of government and all that kind of stuff because really the capitalist system is actually a legal system, that is, it's founded in government, and I'll make that argument, throughout this little podcast episode. But we're going to proceed with that entry level myth that is presented. So they say that businesses decide what to produce based on what they believe consumers will buy, and that's the fundamental thing that's presented in the media and all that. So this decision is, they say, guided by market research, trends, and consumer preferences. Well, that's largely true. It's not just something they say. But again, there are definitely a lot of things that are more complex than that. So essentially, what they say is that it's the invisible hand of the market at work. The weird invisible hand. It's almost like a spooky thing that reaches out to grab you and guide you along. It's sort of a sign that there's a little bit of a mythology involved here, and maybe a little bit of kooky thinking, even like almost like it's a religious thing. But however, from an anarchist perspective, this approach is fundamentally flawed. And I would say it's fundamentally flawed from just a realistic perspective as well, like just from observing what is actually happening in a more nuanced way than just what is presented in some conventional economics textbook or something in a high school. But anyway, the system prioritizes profit over people's real needs quite often, and quite often leads to the overproduction of luxury goods while basic necessities remain scarce for too many people. And the global statistics kind of bear this out. The drive to satisfy consumer demand often neglects the environmental and social costs, perpetuating cycles of exploitation and inequality, and so on and so forth. And of course, there are environmental issues that have definitely become more prominent as the human race, moves onward and upward using this system. And Oh, yeah, regarding the so called invisible hand, you know, I've said this a lot of times on, my blog or a few times on this podcast, I'm sure. All businesses under capitalism are actually legal entities, and the entire economic system is based in law, including the so called free market and its creepy, mysterious, ever thieving invisible hand that is called free choice yet has legal, that is government based, protections, obligations, and threats everywhere that it reaches in and gropes people at. So there's no invisible hand truly at work. It's like a magic trick. Capitalism is actually a vast global legal system that is constantly applying laws to the advantage of capitalists, and it is growing as it feeds those advantages. And that includes special legal protections of power, property, and privileges that really have created corrupt corporate empires. And, let's just face it, plenty of smaller businesses are corrupt in their own little ways as well. That's just a fact. So these are not just decisions people freely make. Lawsuits, laws, and related threats are involved every step of the way, and we know this by taking a simple look at how the economy actually functions. So the other question, or the second question, is how to produce. So the decision on how to produce goods and services in capitalism is driven by the desire to maximize efficiency and profits. Businesses seek the most cost-effective methods to produce high-quality goods. This involves decisions regarding technology, labor, resources, and processes. While this might sound efficient, an anarchist critique would highlight the exploitative nature of such production methods. The division of labor often results in monotonous, unfulfilling work for the majority, while a few reap significant rewards, while disproportionate rewards, of course. Additionally, the focus on cost cutting frequently leads to poor working conditions and environmental degradation. Well, how about that? And the third main question is for whom to produce. So, in a capitalist system, distribution is determined by purchasing power. Goods and services are produced for those who can afford to buy them. So, income, wealth, and market demand play significant roles in deciding who gets what. So, that's definitely true. But this leads to stark inequalities where the wealthy have access to more and typically better quality goods and services, while the poor struggle to meet basic needs. So, an anarchist perspective argues for a more equitable distribution of resources, where production is based on communal needs rather than individual purchasing power. And this approach aims to erode social hierarchies and promote a more egalitarian society. So, whatever you think of that, maybe you're hostile to that idea for whatever reason, but that's what the alternative vision basically entails. So now I'm going to move on to segment two, where we are going to address production and contemporary attitudes towards gendered symbols. So this may be a little bit of a different style of topic, but it really does tie into what I was talking about. So, let's explore how production practices under capitalism affect contemporary attitudes towards gendered symbols. We'll examine historical and modern context to understand how these attitudes have evolved and their impact on gender norms. So, the historical context, an example of that would be if you consider the We Can Do It poster with Rosie the Riveter from World War II, which became an iconic symbol of female empowerment. Originally used to boost workers' morale, it has since been appropriated in various ways to represent feminist strength, but also, just to represent capitalism generally. It's it's a complex symbol at this point because it can mean so many different things. But the production of such symbols can significantly influence gender norms and societal expectations. That's one example of where it was part of a campaign to really just simply say that women can be a part of the economy. So that might be, an example of capitalism actually doing something that was, relatively good. At least if you believe that women should be able to, work, have jobs. So there's a modern context that I could talk into or take us into. Today, capitalism continues to shape gendered symbols through advertising, much like Rosie the Riveter, and of course through media and consumer culture generally. Companies often exploit gender norms to sell products, reinforcing stereotypes and perpetuating gender inequalities at times. I mean, hey, let's face it, that's partly how you make a buck in the capitalist system. You exploit certain inequalities, right? And or certain distinctions between groups, if you just want to put it more in a more apolitical way. So, for example, the beauty industry frequently capitalizes on traditional ideals of femininity, pressuring individuals to conform to specific beauty standards. And whenever there's a move against that, you get people like Jordan Peterson, like, no, no, fat people can't be models or whatever, like. Uh, and it's a complicated issue because, on the one hand, you can say that Victoria's Secret, they can have whatever kind of marketing campaign they want. And I guess there's some truth to that, sure, but I guess one of the main points that a person could raise is, well, shouldn't there be an acknowledgement that other body types exist as well? And so, because of that issue, you are seeing some more products that are marketed towards different types of women, not just the traditional supermodel types are appearing in advertisements. So, from an anarchist standpoint, the practices of sort of idealized bodies and whatnot, those practices are flawed because they reinforce hierarchical structures and their attitudes, and actually, at least in a roundabout way, they limit personal freedom. And really, there's sort of an underlying discriminatory attitude, of course, if you're just constantly saying that people who look a certain way, don't deserve to be recognized even by the broader capitalist system as a whole because they're excluded from appearing in advertisements and stuff like that. So, to a large degree, anarchists would advocate for dismantling those oppressive norms and promoting diverse, inclusive representations or realistic representations that reflect the complexities of gender and identity, and also just acknowledging that different types of people exist. It's not necessarily something that's as politically charged as some people make it out to be. It's really just also a matter of being honest. You know, I can imagine that should have some appeal. Basically, the so-called radical idea is to let people be who they are rather than what society wants them to be. I know, what a spooky idea, like the boogeyman himself under your bed, but that's where some people see things needing to go. So there's some significance there, and there's a reason that some people focused on that a little bit because, well, if we can't even represent people correctly in advertisements and things like that, well, how are we going to really advance as a society when it comes to dealing with other issues? I mean, it's one of those things. So capitalism promotes a lot of conventional so-called traditional imagery, and anytime corporations decide to market to a broader audience, such as LGBT human beings and gender nonconformists, there is conservative, or more accurately, far right pushback. And I say more accurately because, in many ways, conservatism could at least theoretically be fine with LGBT representation in media if they, you know, merely accepted it as a free speech thing and didn't act like a bunch of crybabies about it, and try to cancel every product that advertises just a little bit outside of their view of what is acceptable. And there's a lot to be said about any conservatives out there who actually have enough backbone that they're not crying like a little bitch, for lack of a better word. Maybe that's me being bad when it comes to gender issues, but in this case, I mean bitch in a more gender neutral sort of way. I mean, oddly enough, I think that's one word that has become more gender neutral than it used to be. But anyway, moving on. Understanding the impact of capitalist production and marketing on gendered symbols is valuable for challenging and reshaping contemporary attitudes. By critiquing and deconstructing these symbols, perhaps people can better move towards a more equitable and egalitarian interpretation of gender, or interpretations, because, gender is always in flux. I mean, that's something, again, that a lot of people probably don't want to hear, but it's true. If you look into the history of symbols that are related to gender, you'll find that they can mean different things across different cultures and at different times in culture. For example, the long-heeled shoe, high heels, those started off from what I recall as something that elite men used to wear back in the day, like to show their superior social status. So it wasn't something that women wore originally. And then, of course, you've got the issue of things like kilts, the Scottish kilt, which is not feminine when worn by a Scotsman, but for some reason, if you wear a skirt and you're not, a Scottish person, it's considered feminine. And then, of course, like handbags, some purses are sometimes considered feminine, even though, I mean, what's wrong with carrying a handbag? There's really no reason a man should not be able to do that. It's just convenient and it makes a lot of sense. But anyway, the, you know, when these notions are challenged, I think it can lead to broader social and cultural transformations, fostering a society that values diversity and individual autonomy. So that basically concludes today's episode. You know, I hope you saw that how these issues were kind of tied together in a way, because, I was talking about, the legal system and how corporations are supposed to always look at the bottom line and profitability, and in order to make a profit in a more so-called traditional slash conservative society, they have to market things in a certain way. And in fact, because the legal system is involved in that, there's a bit of legal compulsion, and of course the politicians are pushing certain ideals down other people's throats. So they're trying to codify those standards in the law, and they're going after advertisements as part of that, of course, to have that cultural shift. So it all does kind of tie in together, oddly enough. But anyway, in today's episode, we've dissected how capitalism addresses the basic economic questions, and we examined its impact on gendered symbols. Through an anarchist lens, we've highlighted the inherent flaws and inequalities within these systems. As we continue to challenge and rethink these structures, we move closer to a more just and equitable world, perhaps. So thank you for joining me on this podcast episode. Stay tuned for more insights and discussions. And yeah, Have a beautiful day if at all possible.